Just so that we don't get too far ahead of ourselves, we're talking about how the virus has evolved. I wonder if we could back up maybe half a step and have you explain the basic mechanisms of evolution in general. And again, I'll throw out my lay understanding. Feel free to tell me I'm an idiot because Beery does all the time and he's right. So as I understand it, evolution occurs in a couple of ways. The first is, and you've mentioned this, by random mutations. Something simply goes wrong and there's an insertion or there's a deletion and the genetic material gets shaken up and stirred and mixed around. And I think you said also that those kinds of changes are usually, the term you used, I believe, was deleterious or bad for the gene or the cell itself. But there's a second mechanism that's in play, and that is what I call natural selection. That is to say, an organism evolves because it develops characteristics through evolutionary change that better suit the organism for its environment and to reproduce successfully in that environment. Can you kind of talk about those a bit and distinguish them and relate that to what we've seen from the COVID virus to this point in time?
Yeah. So your description is spot on. So you can really think about the evolutionary process as kind of two different steps. One is the creation of genetic variation, and that occurs through mutation, like you talked about. It can also occur through recombination that we referred to, where you have this distinct genome and this other distinct genome just swapping DNA with each other. So humans, we have recombination. Most organisms have recombination. Viruses also have recombination. When they infect the same, if two viruses are distinct, infect the same cell, then they can swap DNA or RNA with each other. So that's the first step, is just basically creating kind of variation, but it's kind of like noise. Most of these mutations or combinations are poor, they're not very good, but every once in a while you get a combination that is beneficial, that you've stuck new components together that actually work together. And what natural selection is that process where this organism that has an improved genetic code is now able to replicate faster, spread to more people, and is selected for. And so the first step is creation of genetic variation. The second step is natural selection. The second step is actually a little bit broader than just natural selection. The second step is really just, you have this genetic variation, most of it goes away, but some of it actually spreads in the population and transforms that species or that strain that you're looking at. And so that can happen by natural selection if some of those variants are good, but it can also happen by another process called genetic drift. And what this is just sort of luck of the draw. This is like flipping a coin, that some mutations, maybe they have no effect at all on the fitness of the organism, but they end up spreading for, just reasons, stochastic random reasons that are impossible to predict, but basically just because of a lottery system. And so a lot of what makes it hard to monitor the evolution of an organism in this virus is that we never know if a mutation is spreading because of this stochastic genetic drift, or if it's spreading because of it's actually adaptive and it's improving the virus's ability to use us, which is obviously a really bad thing. So for the coronavirus itself, and what's happening right now, is that this virus actually has a relatively low mutation rate compared to HIV or influenza, these other RNA viruses that we know a lot more about. So it has a slower rate of mutation, and so that's good for us. It has a slower rate of evolution because of that, but it does have an error rate in creating creating copies of its genome, and so it is mutating. That's how we're able to track it around the world and see how it spread from one country to another country. We can sort of track when it got different mutations and follow those as if they were kind of breadcrumbs, creating a trail. And so some of those mutations, most of those mutations probably do nothing, um, but some of those mutations may be adaptive. And so there is a huge debate underway at the moment on whether or not these mutations are changing characteristics of the virus and if we have to worry about those changes. And there has been a number of articles in the scientific literature going back and forth on this subject, and also the New York Times and the LA Times uh, had different articles that were reacting to each other. And actually, the New York Times has, by the same author, Carl Zimmer, who I really love his writing, has a couple articles on this one specific mutation in SARS-CoV-2, where first his article was very critical of whether or not this mutation was adaptive. And now researchers have shown that this mutation is adaptive. And so he's kind of had to walk that back a little bit. And so there's one prime example of an adaptive mutation in SARS-CoV-2 that is certainly enhancing the virus's ability to infect human cells and likely spread faster in human populations. So this is a mutation in that spike protein, and it's a single mutation that changes a single amino acid in this protein, but it changes it in a way that it stabilizes the protein, enhances its interactions with human proteins. So human cells have proteins on the outer membrane. The virus attaches to those and then triggers an infection. And so that attachment step is really important for the infection process. And so this mutation enhances its ability to find those cells and attach to them. And so a number of different studies have shown evidence at different levels. One, the first study just showed that this mutation was really common in viral sequences that we had from around the world, and that it appeared that it was so common that you couldn't explain this by random genetic drift, but that it had to be selected for by natural selection. That's not a really great level of evidence. That's this correlative kind of evidence that we talked about before. But then other people followed that up, and they performed lab experiments where they looked at the direct effect of this mutation on the infection process, and can show that this had a number of different effects on improving its ability to exploit cells in cell culture, not in human bodies, but in cell culture. But if you take all of these sort of different bits of evidence together, it does appear that there is a more virulent strain of the virus spreading. Now, I don't know how much more virulent it is, or maybe I shouldn't even say virulent, I should say infectious. So I don't know how much worse this strain is. I think coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2 variant in general is just really bad. And so this just might be like a little extra bad on top of really, really bad. But it does seem that the virus is mutating and adapting to humans. I think the main concern is just of the virus in general, not of these particular mutations. But it is this really interesting example of, seeing in action a virus jump into a host species that it's not well adapted to, spread around the world, and gain mutations that improve its ability at exploiting this host species.
Can I ask one other question, Brendan, before I throw it to you? Like I said, I could go on forever, but does what you just said give us any indication as to how rapidly we can expect this virus to continue to mutate adaptively in the future? In other words, can you look at the time from when this virus first came on the scene to when this adaptive mutation sort of took hold, and can you use that to predict future adaptations in any way?
Yeah, so it is really hard to predict the rate of adaptation in viruses and in organisms in general. We can look at the RNA sequences of SARS-CoV-2, and actually they tend to change at a very repeatable rate. So it is accumulating about one mutation in its genome per 2 weeks. It has a genome of about 30,000 bases, and so that's actually very small. Certainly viruses like HIV and influenza mutate a lot faster. And so that's very repeatable, and that's going to continue probably well into the future. That sort of underlying rate of change to the genome, but that's of all changes. That's not just of adaptive changes. So a small subset of those are adaptive, and whether or not we can actually say how many of those will be adaptive and how that will improve the rate at which it'll improve the virus's ability to infect us over time. Those are things that we would love to be able to do, but the science just isn't there yet.